Hey everybody, so I just want to take a moment to go through a hand that was posted just now on the hand analysis channel, and I think this one's pretty interesting because there are a few things that I want to talk about that we don't see in many hands, but I think there's a lot of exploitative merit to the particular line taken. With that said, we're playing as hero, who is holding pocket fives here, and then our opponent, the only info we have on them is just that they think that we might be a little bit aggressive, that we might have a lot of crazy bluffs, stuff like that. So they decide to go for a 3-bet here, and we decide to call. And then on the flop, this is going to be an interesting line because hero elects to donk. Now this is definitely a board where you can donk, and I think this actually has a lot of exploitative merit, which we'll talk about pretty shortly. But let's have a look at the hand first. So we donk, our opponent goes and they call, and on the turn it's going to be the ace of diamonds, it goes check check, totally fine. And then on the river it's the 8 of diamonds. So here, hero decides to do something interesting. They go for a 2x pot overbet, and then the villain is actually going to fold here. So definitely a lot of interesting stuff to talk about, but I want to start with that flop donk first. So if we head over to GTO Wizard, you can definitely see that block, like donking for a small size here is more than fine at Nash. And I think there are a few different concepts which sort of tie into the exploitative merit of this donk. So first of all, the thing that I want to focus on specifically is going to be our opponent's raise strategy. You can see that versus the donk, in position has a lot of raises. A lot of these raises are pretty natural to find. There's a lot of pocket 8s, pocket 7s, a lot of overpairs as well, and these hands are pretty important to talk about, and we'll talk about them shortly. But there also are a lot of mergy hands, like ace 7. A lot of stuff like ace 4, I guess, at a tiny frequency. 5-4 even, right? A lot of bluffs in general coming from just the bottom of our opponent's calling range. So just hovering here, you'll see bluffs, I guess, from all sorts of these different hands out of low frequencies. Queen 9, for instance, stuff like that. And I think it's fairly clear to say that our opponents are definitely going to be playing something a little bit different from what we are looking at right here. And I think there are two main mistakes that I want to talk about which tie into that exploitative merit. So the first mistake is that our opponents might not be bluff raising enough. When we hold pocket 5s, it might seem like we want to get raised by hands like Queen 9, because obviously we are winners versus those hands. We have a made pair, we have a draw. Those hands don't really have very much going for them besides the 2 overcards. But in general, when our hand is weak and when our hand has a lot of EV to lose versus the raise, right? So we go from 5.7 to 1.9, then when our opponent bluff raises a little bit less, our EV is going to increase because we're getting into this node where our EV drops pretty substantially less often. So yes, our hand definitely gets a bit devalued when we face that raise, and we are going to lose a bit of EV when we're looking at this node in isolation. But the fact is, when we get to that node less often, because our opponent raises less, this EV is going to go up. You can definitely play around in node locking to see that effect in action. The second mistake that our opponents could be making are just raising a little bit too face up of a range. That consists of too many overpairs, maybe a bit too many strong hands as well, stuff like that. Our opponents are in position, and so they might feel like they have to just get the money in since there's no additional like check raising here. On the other hand, they can control the size of the pot, so it definitely makes a lot of sense intuitively to call pocket aces, pocket kings. It's tough to say what the specific mistake is, but I do think in general it's a little bit too easy for our opponents to just go a bit too straightforward with the value raises. And especially when we look at hands like ace 7, they're probably not finding enough raises with this one here, and they might overcompensate by just raising too much of 10s, 9s. This hand in particular just seems like a pretty intuitive raise, since you do want to get a lot of protection, all sorts of stuff like that. And so when our opponent is raising a very straightforward range, which consists of too many overpairs, then you'll actually see that the EV of pocket 5s will increase. It is non-linear, however, so when our opponent is raising a little bit too many strong hands like overpairs, then our EV will initially drop a little bit because we're facing a stronger range. But when our opponent is raising so many strong hands that our own hand becomes actually quite strong versus our opponent's call line, then our EV skyrockets pretty exponentially. So when our opponent is raising a tiny bit too many overpairs, the EV of hands like ace-8 and pocket fives will decrease. But if our opponent is overdoing it substantially, then very quickly we get into very positive EV territory. And the extent of the mistake that they have to make in general is quite small for our hand to gain EV as a bet. But it's really tough to know if our opponent is making a big mistake on this board or not. Because like I said, there's a couple different competing incentives. So they might, over-raise with nines, but also overcall with kings. It's a little bit tough to say. But either way, I think it's pretty fair to say that the raising frequency is going to be a bit lower. And probably that's just coming from them missing a lot of hands like these, and then also missing hands like these. So donking is definitely a very nice exploitative strategy, and it's something that I do very, very often, especially playing on unknown pools. So let's head over to the turn, since we talked about the flop a lot. The turn is played fine either as a check or as a bet, even disregarding just the fact that it's mixing in solver. So we definitely want to have a decent amount of turn barrels here after donking, because otherwise we're just going to be going for the donk check very often, and it's very easy for our opponent to just exploit us. In fact, by overcalling, then that would be a pretty decent exploit, just because they have to, they have the opportunity to over-realize their equity pretty substantially. So it's important to have some bets here, and that's mainly just to conceal our strategy. I don't think bluffing in here is going to be the highest EV option, but it's just important for us to do it sometimes. So if we decide to go for the check, and button decides to check back, the river here we were looking at was the ace of diamonds, 8 of diamonds. So this one, again, is pretty interesting, because Hero decided to go for the 2x overbet. And the 2x overbet isn't even a size that's really present in solver, so we only go from 150 to 300, but I do have a couple thoughts on this size and on this specific river as well. And that is that if I were bluffing on this river, I would probably choose a smaller size. If our opponent thinks that we're pretty aggressive and we're using 150, you can already see that some of these top pairs are starting to fold. If you go for B300, then these hands are folding a lot more often. And I do think our opponent is going to get here with a decent number of them. It is possible that playing as button, they might just elect to bet too many hands like pocket aces, pocket jacks. Sorry, not pocket jacks, like ace jack and ace 10. So in general, I might be inclined to think that they have less ace x here. But if we're betting so big that all of these pocket pairs are already folding, then we're not really exploiting any specific part of their range, especially when they think that we have a very aggressive table image, and so they might just overcall with hands like ace 10, ace jack, which they still definitely get here sometimes with. If we happen to use a smaller size, like B60, then we force them to call with a large number of underpairs. But on this specific river, again, it might be a little bit easy for our opponent to overcall with hands like pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket nines. Again, if they have that image of us, like that really crazy, like if we have that really crazy table image. Another board, like there is a different board which I think bluffing on would be a little bit better. That would be something like a king. Because here you can see that versus a small bet, our opponents should still be calling queens through nines. But all of a sudden, these hands are a little bit tougher to call since they are a third pair. From our opponent's point of view, it might be just a little bit more gut-wrenching to find a call with pocket nines here when it doesn't even beat second pair. Of course, that's not to say that we're necessarily betting second pair or anything, but even then, you can see that pocket, like king 10, king 9 are folding. So it definitely is a weird spot to go for the river bluff. I think there are some better turns, some better rivers, which yield better results. But if you want to bluff here, it's definitely going to be more than fine. I think the most important thing that we talked about here was the merit of that flop donk. And then also the fact that it's important to recognize that we still have to follow through at some frequency on the turn, and we can't really play a face-up strategy of just checking all of our medium strength pairs here. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Leave more hands in hand analysis, and maybe I'll go through some of them and make other videos in the future. Goodbye.